and welcome to the Publishing Executive and Book Business webinar, How Content Structure and Data Extraction Facilitate New Product Development, sponsored by DCL. My name is Dennis Wilson, Content Director for Publishing Executive and Book Business, and the host for today's event. Before we get started, let me take a second to point out the Tips for Attendees widget on your console. It's the blue icon with the wrench on it. If you missed the Tech Tips video we played leading up to the webinar, you can always click this widget for more information. And I also wanted to remind everyone that you can submit questions to the Q&A box throughout the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can during the Q&A portion. So let's get to the program for today. Content structure and semantics are the building blocks that enable downstream capabilities, such as search engine and database discoverability, consumption through voice interfaces, and new monetization opportunities. In this webinar, we'll hear how data extraction combined with well-structured content can impact the bottom line for publishers and unlock previously buried information, creating important resources for the world. And we have three fantastic speakers joining us today to explore this topic. First, we have Mark Gross, President of DCL. Mark is a recognized authority on XML implementation and document conversion. Mark also serves as project executive with overall responsibility for resource management and planning. And Mark is a frequent speaker on the topic of automated conversions to XML and SGML. Next, we have Sean Redmond, Senior Product Manager at the New York Public Library. At the New York Public Library, Sean has worked on various digital products over the past 6 years. Altogether, he has almost 30 years experience in digital cultural heritage at institutions such as the American Museum of Natural History and the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. And finally, we have Bill Kasdorf, Principal of Kasdorf & Associates, which is a publishing consultancy focused on accessibility, XML, HTML, EPUB modeling, information infrastructure, standards, and editorial and production workflows. He is also founding partner of Publishing Technology Partners. Bill is active in the W3C and is a member of the Society for Scholarly Publishing, the Book Industry Study Group, the International Press Telecommunications Council, and the WIPO's Accessible Books Consortium. So I want to say thanks to all three of you for joining us and speaking today. And now I'll turn it over to Mark to start things off.
Thank you, Dennis. There's a bit of an irony going on in what we're talking about. While the world is dealing with smartphone addiction and always getting the latest information through messaging and Twitter feeds and constantly Googling the latest facts, that's really only the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more information, very valuable information out there that's not online, that's hidden away in libraries, special collections, and all kinds, in your collections of information of people who are in this webinar. And as the project going on at NYPL shows, it's not enough to just scan and make images available online. Not when there's millions and billions of pages to deal with. You need a way to organize information so you can find it and organize it, and you can get the specific information you need. And finally, create those new products that your customers need. We shall probably look on those smartphones that we're all addicted to. So I think it's a really exciting program today. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, but I think the centerpiece is the project that Sean is going to be talking about, which is taking 100 years or I think more of copyright data. It's hundreds of volumes of information and moving it from a printed page to online databases where they can be at the tip of your fingers. And then afterwards, my colleague of many years, Bill Kasdorf, gives a very colorful overview of how data structuring works and how important it is. And hopefully we have some time for questions at the end. But first, a little information, a little bit about who we are. Our business, data conversion laboratory, DCL's business, is intelligent data transformation. And what that means is we take all kinds of content, and from historical library collections, as well as modern financial records or high-speed news feeds, and structured information can be used in all the ways we just discussed. And while we've been doing this for decades, what makes it so exciting today are the tools that are now available, using the latest tools in artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, that lets us automate what traditionally was a very laborious process. And I want to underline, it makes projects that were just not commercially, economically feasible even a few years ago, something that's worth looking at now. And I think this, what's going on NYPL is one of those kind of projects. Just a little bit about, where we start with, the subtitle on this is Life After Scanning, or the importance of structure. And while over the last few years, a lot of very large collections have been digitized, it's hundreds of thousands of pages and millions of pages have been digitized, they've been scanned. And scanning serves a very important function. It allows for preservation of materials that otherwise might just disappear over the years, especially when people don't have space for it. It sits in people's basements and stuff, in libraries' basements. So it serves the needs for preservations for all kinds of organizations, libraries, government, scientific organizations, industry, and the technology has gotten better. The scans are very good, even for bound books. It's an inexpensive process, and but while that's very valuable and lots better than microfilm, which is the previous alternative, it still, if you've scanned these images and you've got lots of pages you've got images of millions of pages, it's very hard to find what you're looking for. You can't search on an image. So then came automated OCR, and I guess it started commercially in the 70s, and it's gotten better, much better over the years. It's optical character recognition is today an inexpensive automated process. It's almost done automatically when you scan a page. Accuracy's gotten better. While it's not perfect, it's good enough for lots of different kinds of applications, particularly simpler kinds of pages. Where it falls apart is when materials get complex and where structure is needed. So if we look at this, if you've got materials that are technical nature and they have, like the first image on the left is got some chemistry on it, and it's got numbering on the left side of the page, OCR on this does not do a particularly good job. There's all kinds of noise on that page, and it's a mess. If you look at the second one over there, you've got tables over there. OCR, that doesn't do you very much because you need to know what the structure of that page is. Because the fact it's a table means that you've got columns and rows, and where they line up is very important, and all that is not going to come across when you're dealing with just OCR. Yes, you'll get a lot of the characters over. You won't get the math symbols in. You won't get the structure. It won't line up, and a table is not necessarily going to be a table anymore. The same is true of forms, where you've got information in particular places, and then when you've got things on the page like signatures and things that are on there, that also totally messes up what's there. So any of these kind of pages, when you try to search for them, is just not really going to work very well. So luckily what we've got now, and this is referring back to the technology that have developed, I mean, it used to be the only way to do pages like that was really to scan it to OCR and then do a lot of work by hand. Technology we have now allows you to, while it's not a fully automated process by any means, allows you to reduce a lot of the labor effort that might have been there before. And Sean's going to go into this in a lot more detail, but what this is doing, what this lets you do is really keep your information at several different levels. It takes information that was really flat, a flat page, and really gives you several more dimensions to it. If you look at the bottom page, that right on top of that smartphone, that sort of gives you what a multi-column page and directory would look like. The white on black page above that is what happens when it's been not only OCR'd but also been tagged with information, so that and Sean will go into more detail, but a name is defined as a name, and a publisher is defined as a publisher, and all the other pieces that are important in a complex document are identified explicitly. While it's not too easy for humans to read this, it's very easy for computers to read this. And the top layer over here is what a computer, what a user interface might look like that lets you search through these large databases and find exactly what you need. And the technologies that are used to do this are those kind of artificial intelligence technologies, computer vision, natural language processing, all those kind of things, which have really come to the fore, have been around for a while, but they've really been come to the fore with tools just over the last few years. And with that, Sean, I'm going to pass it along to you to tell us about this wonderful project.
Great, thanks. Yeah, as Mark mentioned, we've got some projects we're working on at NYPL, and in particular with DCL, we are dealing with the transcription and parsing of records from the Copyright Office, U.S. Copyright Office. And I work on this with my colleague at the library, Greg Cram, who is he is a copyright lawyer, and he has a number of interests in this data. He deals with knowing what we can give access to and how we can give access to all the various things we have in our collection, and other things that might just sort of flow through our library services. And copyright is obviously very important for this. And the most sort of present project that we have that needs this data is one where we are trying to figure out, can we identify books that are in copyright but that are out of print? And if we can find those books, can we then find the authors or the rights holders of the books and come to an agreement with them to allow us to digitize them and distribute them to the library, right? These are books that we can't buy. They're out of print. We can't get them digitally. We can't just digitize them because they're in copyright, right? So we're trying to track down this category of books. And the first step, obviously, is knowing if something is in copyright. And to do that, we have to go back to the copyright records that are held in the U.S. Copyright Office. And just to give a brief refresher for people that know this, like books will fall into like three big categories. Anything published 1923 or before is already in the public domain, so that's easy. Anything published 1964 or later is also easy because it's just in copyright, and it will be in copyright for a few more decades. In between those two dates is the interesting part. So between 1923 and 1964, something would have had a copyright of 28 years. It could then be renewed for another 28. So something published in 1930 would be in copyright till 1958, at which point it could be renewed for more. And the copyright law was later changed. So basically what we have is if anything was not renewed in that period, it is public domain. If it was renewed in that period, it is not public domain. So we need to distinguish, these two things. So I'm going to first give a little overview of the records and then get into our particular project. So, what is in these records that the Copyright Office has, right? Essentially, this is a record of creativity, right? It's a record of so many things that so many people created. Essentially we're talking about the 20th century. The particular project we're working on now, we're dealing with books, but of course in the copyright records, there are photographs, there are films, there are plays, there are sculptures, all sorts of materials. And everything, is there in the office in Washington. And really, it all starts with a card catalog. So the copyright records, for every registration for a copyright or a renewal, there's a card in a card catalog. And if you're really in a dispute or really curious about the copyright of something, then you actually need to go back to these physical cards. Make a trip to Washington, find a drawer, and pull out the card. Now, clearly, it's 21st century. The Library of Congress, they've scanned all these cards, and they do have an interface where you can get at them digitally, called their virtual card catalog. It is kind of interestingly still patterned after the idea of like going to a drawer and finding the card. So you're not really just like, searching for whatever you're looking for. It's like you still need to sort of go through the process that you would in the physical room. And this is what the cards look like, right? So they have scanned the cards, right? But like Mark was talking about, it's just a picture of the card. Some of the information is extracted, not all of it. It's not quite as useful as we would hope it would be, but it's still an amazing undertaking that the Library of Congress has managed to do what they've done. Most of the time, though, you're not using the cards. Most of the time, you're using what's called the catalog of copyright entries. And these are printed volumes, mostly extremely large, that are, it is all the things that were registered, in the year for, whatever the annual volume is. It's the same information that's on the cards, right, just presented differently. But mostly, obviously the cards are in Washington, the books are all around. The books have also been scanned, so you can get them through the Copyright Office, you can get them through Google Books, you can get them through the Internet Archive, but they are just scans. So it is these books that we're working on with DCL, and particularly the volumes that deal with book registrations. Other volumes are, like this one, art and film, or sculptures, or dramas. And they look, like a phone book, sort of. So, here's a renewal for The Great Gatsby, right? So if you want to check out the copyright of The Great Gatsby, right, you try and figure out what year it might have been published or renewed, find the volume for that year, go through the index, and you're trying to find, this entry. So, okay, it was renewed in 1953, so we know it's still in copyright. And, it's obviously laborious. Like I said, through the Library of Congress, you can get some of the records. Later records are electronic, but for these 20th century records, they're mostly not. And there are two parts, registrations and renewals. So the renewals have already been transcribed and parsed by a project at Stanford. So that's very useful. So if you need to find a renewal, you can go to the Stanford website and you can search for a title, search for an author, search for any keyword, and see if you can find a renewal. But it doesn't go back always to doesn't go back ever to the original registrations. And of course, not everything is renewed. So what the Renewal Database doesn't answer for us is how many things weren't renewed. And obviously, all this really should be easier, right? It just seems like a very old-fashioned, laborious way at getting at things. And it's easy to imagine some kind of interface where you just go search for something like, keywords Flying Express Dixon, and can get back all the information about a book that's held in any of the Copyright Office records, right? So basic information, being able to see the original records, which include registrations and renewals, images from the card catalog, and some other documents that that the Copyright Office has. And that it's easier to work with this information in general, right? So all this information should be linked together, right? So if you search for something, you get this result, right? You want to be able to click on the author's name, see what else has Franklin Dixon registered. What other things from Grosset and Dunlap can we find? Right. So the basic things people expect to do with computers and data. So with DCL, we're working on two parts: transcription and parsing. Right. So taking the original catalog of copyright entries, right? So here's an example of a book. So here's the registration entry for this Hardy Boys mystery. So, from the picture, we want to be able to extract the text, right? So that's the basics of transcription. And this is basically OCR, which Mark mentioned is pretty easy and pretty expensive now, but it doesn't quite go far enough for making the data really useful and something you can really find things out from and build on. For that, you need to do the parsing, right? So starting again, here's our entry. We don't want to extract just the text, right? We want to know, what does the text mean, right? So beyond just the simple letters that are on the page, right? What part is the title? what part is the author's name, what part is the registration number. And be able to preserve that in some useful way, probably useful for a computer. If it's useful for a human being also, then that's great. So here's an example of the same record. Now we've transcribed it and parsed it. We haven't. The people at DCL have. So this is what we get back from what we have DCL doing for us. They're parsing it into XML. This is not a pleasant chunk of text to read, but it's really good for a computer. If you look in it, you can see the author's name is tagged and the title is tagged. Again, it's great for a computer. The little thing at the bottom is the row from our prototype database where we've taken the XML that we've now parsed and loaded that up into a database, right? So that we can now do all the searching on it that we want. We can combine it with the renewals that have already been transcribed and parsed by the Stanford project, right? And we can start to answer some real questions about what's in this data. And beyond the obvious one of how many of these things are renewed and how many things aren't, you can immediately start thinking of all sorts of things about publishers, when were publishers active, where are the centers of book publication over time, right? It just opens up a world of possibilities. There are some problems to deal with first that are kind of interesting, so we just like to show some of the things that we find in the data. And the problems can have to do with the OCR or with the parsing, right? The transcription or figuring out like how we should tag the data. Since we're just going from printed records and all sorts of things can happen. So here is a nice record that we have. This is an image from the Internet Archive version of this. And we've circled the registration number, which we looked at for a long time and couldn't figure out if it was 38996 or 38906. But there are multiple versions, so let's look at some of the other ones. Well, the Google Books version doesn't really help, but maybe if we go back to our microfilm that we have at the library, that'll be better. And obviously that's not either, right? So just dealing with some of the loss of the information, getting it out of the printed material, is something we just have to overcome. Some of the information is just by its nature hard, right? So the Bell system published a lot of handbooks and rule books and phone books, and the entries for these things go on for pages and pages and pages, right? So just how do we group these things together correctly? How do we make sure that we're getting all of the addenda? Is this tricky? It's par for the course, but it's something we have to figure out how to handle. There are handwritten corrections, and these don't seem to be things that people corrected in their copy of the book, but that the Copyright Office systematically recorded by hand in every copy we've ever seen, which is kind of amazing of its own. Can we trust it? Do we want to update the data? Do we want to record the correction for posterity? If someone's looking at our XML, do we want them to know, like, oh, this entry was updated or corrected from a handwritten correction in the original volume? I should go back and look at that. We also have corrections that are just taped into the pages, like this one. And this example is one where a whole bunch of entries were incorrect. And what they did for that volume was duplicate the cards from the card catalog and just paste those pages into the volumes themselves, right? So we have to decide, like, how are we going to record that, or do we need to? And then some things you don't learn until you have the data. So you would, expect ID numbers to be unique. And once we had enough data, we thought we would test that. So let's see, are all the ID numbers actually unique? And of course, we found that they weren't. Right. So here's two entries with the same registration ID number. This one we think is a typo, right? There are plenty of typos also in the printed volumes. From other records, we might be able to correct it. But since we've also found 20 entries with the same registration number, which I think happened because I imagine they were using one of those self-incrementing stamps, to stamp the registration number on each form that came in or something. And I imagine the stamp just got stuck for a while and nobody noticed, and they stamped a bunch of entries with the same registration number. But another advantage to having things in a digital format is you can track the problems more easily. So we get the XML back from DCL. We put it into a public GitHub repository where we can track the typos and the problems as bugs like we would for software, right? So it's easy for us to flag something and remind ourselves that we want to deal with that and have a record of what we did. So what have we learned from this so far? So let's give us a couple highlights from the data that we've collected. So we can count things pretty simply. So this graph shows us a comparison. The blue line are the number of books published per year according to data in HathiTrust, which is sort of a nonprofit analog to Google Books, right? So they hold the scans of pretty much every book that's in a library. The green line is the count of things that were registered in the catalog of copyright entries. So obviously they don't match. So it's curious, for instance, that pretty much before World War II, the number of items in HathiTrust is lower than the number of items in the copyright records. After World War II, that switches. So the library has more things than we would expect from the copyright records. So we're interested in figuring out what is the source of this divergence, right? We can start to look and see like where are the extra records coming from, or where are the missing records to be supplied. And just to get back to what I mentioned at the beginning, right, we're trying to figure out what's in copyright and what's out of copyright. So here's our comparison, right? So these are the counts from the volumes that we've done with DCL. So there are a few gaps you see down in the 20s. Those are things that we're currently working on. We expect to have those done in the next few months. But the blue part are the books that were registered and renewed, and the orange part are the books that were registered and not ever renewed, right? So the blue ones are the ones that are still on copyright. The orange ones are the ones that are now public domain. The big jump after 1953 is an artifact of the way the volumes are published. So they started putting lectures and pamphlets and contributions to magazines and things together with the books. So we just haven't separated those out. But we expect like the number of books didn't jump, that it probably was kind of a linear progression like the renewals. So from this, comparing the blue to the orange, we estimate that 70% of the books published in this period from 1923 to 1964 are now public domain. They were never renewed. It's just been very hard to tell up until now, right? But now that we've got the data converted XML, we can put it in a database, we can do simple queries, right? It's very easy for us to see how many books are in copyright and out of copyright, and even as to say like, well, which are the books that are in copyright? Which ones are the ones that are public domain? So overall, like so far we have about 880,000 books in our database from these copyright records. So we would expect about 616,000 of them to be public domain, and very easy for us as a library to deal with, right? If somebody needs one of these books and wants it digitally, we can just do it. The other ones, like we have to figure out what the copyright, who the rights holder is, and how can we deal with it if we want to digitize it, or how can we find it if we want to buy a digital version from whoever's got it now. And the last two slides, just a couple of things online, and I think the URL to these things are going to come up in the Q&A for you if you want to follow up on this. So first is a blog post that my colleague Greg Cram wrote about the project. There are lots of links in here to the other things that I've talked about. and just general overview of what we're doing. And everything that we're doing is publicly available online. All the information is public domain. It's U.S. government information. Public domain to us. Everything we're doing in the public domain. So you can go to our repository where we have all the XML hosted, poke around, download the files. You let us know if you see errors, and follow along. It's all in the public eye. So that's what we're doing with this data. DCL is helping us greatly with. I guess with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Mark.
Hey, thank you, Sean. That was fascinating. Really great presentation. I think it highlights, just what you can do with data once you've got it organized and structured. This is information, and especially the last few slides you showed, information that you never could have gotten. You could have guessed, but wouldn't have gotten even close, probably. And while it's very specialized data in this library world, you can see how the same kind of analytics could be helpful in other areas where you really don't have structured information, like financial records and annual reports, which are not available, not the ones from the last 20 years, which are electronic, but the ones before that, or other areas where information can be pulled together. And it's clear that while scanning is a great first step for preservation, that's what was done here years ago, and was certainly the right decision. And a lot of material like that was done that way. There are millions and millions of pages that are preserved in various places. It's very limited for those documents that are going to be used for research or for reference and other uses. It's what I think, and again, I want to underline, scanning is really just the first step, and today it's time to revisit digitization and structure and see what's available. Primarily because the technology is there. All those things that have been scanned, it may be time to rethink what to do with that and take it to the next step. Just rethink what needs to be done. Add structure where you can take those collections. That's what exactly was done here. We used the images that were put together by the Internet Archives over the last few years. Didn't have to rescan anything. We just took those and worked with those and added those additional layers. So the content collections were previously scanned and not structured. Semantic tagging can be added, which is not just tagging what it is, but in context with what's in the rest of the page. Information can be recreated from those images. Complex content, the OCR then didn't really do a great job. Special characters, math, symbols. So all that information can be recreated, and there's a lot of automation available which does two things. One is it reduces whatever costs looked like, even 5 years ago or 3 years ago may be totally different, and automation adds a level of reliability because computers, while people are very good at analyzing a lot of things, computers are very consistent and a lot of these kind of applications can be quite cost effective where they weren't before. They were just not even feasible before. So now I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who will talk about how these concepts apply not just to copyright records, but just about any kind of information can be used to create new products. What happened to copyright records, these are really new products that didn't exist before. In every field, that same kind of logic can apply. So over to you, Bill.
Thanks a lot, Mark. One thing that I really want to kind of expand this discussion. First of all, it was a fascinating presentation, so thanks a lot to both Mark and Sean for all that. I was not aware of that project at NYPL. I'm very glad to know about it because I've actually got clients that will be able to use that data that you've created. But a lot of the focus so far in this webinar has been on legacy content, and one thing that I want to really emphasize, since our main theme is the importance of structure, is how important it is for your existing products too, the products that you're creating and publishing today. So most content that's actually delivered to end users today is really unstructured, or when it has formatting, and I'm talking about, for example, the PDFs that most people get electronic versions of print products as PDFs, the tags that are there are meaningless because it says this thing is bold, this thing is indented, this thing has space above, etc. So for all intents and purposes, it's just a big jumble of unstructured content. If you put structure into your content, you actually are making something of it, right? You're making it functional. And the key is that fundamentally what structure is doing, we're talking in this very abstract way, it's really about naming the pieces of the content. What are the different parts and how do they go together? And fundamentally that's what things like XML do. It provides a way to express those things. And it also means that you can navigate, you can find your way through and around your content if there's structure. Otherwise you're just at a loss. And so I really want to just focus on three particular areas. There are more, but these three I think are really interesting and essential that show why structure is so important. One is search, one is the management of your content, and the third is accessibility, which increasingly is getting onto people's radar as being really a mandate, that people really need to make sure their content is accessible. Unstructured content really doesn't work for any of those three things. It's basically useless for all of those purposes. What any of those processes, search, content management, accessibility, need to do is to find the pieces that they need and know where those pieces are. So in the case of search, for example, maybe I want to find an article that has the word blockchain in the title. I have to know what the title is. I want to find an article where Mark is an author. Well, I need to know where the author name is. Or maybe I want to find, actually, let's say Mark is reading a journal article. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to look at the references to see if he's cited in that journal article. I'm telling you, I do a lot of work with scholarly publishing. That's the first thing an author, a scholar does when she's reading a new article, is look at the references, see if she's been cited in it. But again, you need to know what the references are, and actually what you need to know is where's the contributor name in a reference. And even more than just the pieces, you can actually prioritize those pieces, right? So your search can say, if the word blockchain is in a heading, it's more important than the word blockchain just coming up in a paragraph someplace, right? So these are all examples of where getting some really useful semantic structure in your content is important. Let me just do a little sidebar here, because I use the word semantic. Semantic is used in two different senses. I'm talking about structural semantics. In other words, what are the pieces, what are the names of those pieces? Title, author, reference, heading, paragraph, etc. Content semantics refers to what the content is about. That's also important and useful. But for structure, we're talking about structural semantics, naming and identifying and organizing the pieces. And so you can imagine that for content management, that's also extremely important. Oftentimes, particularly complex content, things like a textbook, for example, there are many, many authors contributing to a textbook, authors and illustrators and editors, etc. And these people are working, just to use a little jargon, asynchronously, right? They're not starting with writing chapter 1 and then they work their way all the way to the end. All these people are working on all parts of this thing at once, and then you need to assemble it. That's for the traditional textbook. Today, what's even more powerful is you need to be able to assemble it in different ways. So when an education publisher, for example, would publish a textbook, they were fixing not just the structure, but the sequence of everything in that book. But now what they're mainly moving toward is platforms where the student can access the content in the order that suits him or her, and skip over things that the student has mastered, spends more time on some extra content, etc. So anyway, all of that ability to control, assemble, and manage these pieces is all based on structural markup. Finding the right parts that you need, reusing those parts. So a lot of publishers are realizing that they've got value, in a sense, buried in their existing products because there's no way to individually locate and identify and extract valuable pieces. A classic example is illustrations. Both Mark and I have lots of examples of publishers. One I'll cite with a project that I'm familiar with was the Life magazine archive. You're probably familiar with the pictures in Life magazine. A number of years ago, they had just millions of images that had no structure, no metadata, no information about them, and so they basically couldn't monetize them. And you can just imagine the value to Time Life. Unfortunately, they didn't keep them alive financially, but the value that they were able to get out of those images. This happens a lot in science as well. Springer Nature, a number of years ago, actually when it was just Springer, produced an image resource that's basically making available images that are in all the books and journals that they publish, and getting more value out of them. So you can combine parts, reuse parts, recombine them to make new publications. And then finally, accessibility. What's called assistive technology, that's the technologies that people with various kinds of visual, cognitive, motor disabilities need to use to help them access content that people without those disabilities can just natively derive from the visual or physical book or the online ebook or website. So that assistive technology needs to know what the component parts are. They need to know where a chapter starts. They need to know where headings are, etc. Because the headings are what tells that blind user or other user assistive technology where something in content is actually a subsection of a parent section. That's important information. It lets that user navigate to the place that she needs to get to. For example, a user of assistive technology may, like I bet you and I, need to skip the footnotes when you're reading things that are something that's heavily footnoted. Well, you have to know where the footnotes are, what the footnotes are. And also, you need to be able to go back and reread something like, wait a second, I need to reread this section of this paragraph, etc. You need to be able to jump back to the beginning of that section. So, all that functionality is really dependent on good structure. And by the way, let me put in a plug for the standards groups that I'm involved in. Really, the proper form for the interchange of accessible content is EPUB 3. Many people think PDFs are accessible, and they can be made more accessible than they typically are, but they're not reflowable, and they don't offer nearly the accessibility that a well-tagged EPUB 3 does. And the tagging in there is not rocket science. It's just proper HTML tagging. So anyway, that's my commercial for accessibility. Mainly, I just want to close by emphasizing that structured content is just plain better content, period. So, thanks a lot. I think we've got our 15 minutes for Q&A.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, we're going to turn it over to some Q&A now. So I want to come back to some of the things that our speakers talked about in terms of the logistics of creating a better content, which is structured content, as Bill says. But first question I want to ask the group is in regards to more to potential applications. So this comes from an audience member. How can structured content benefit niche publishing organizations? This person handles content for an international equestrian sports publishing company. So how could structured content improve their workflow for multi-channel publishing model, including print, website, social media, streaming video? Will this help us unlock previously unused content like images? Mark, maybe you can start off with this question in terms of how some of these strategies can be used for somebody like this, a niche publisher.
Right, and I'll start on that, but maybe Bill might want to add to it because that's some of what he was talking about over here. But I think any niche publisher, any publisher can really gain from being able to separate the different pieces and identifying them and where they fit. The specifically, we talked about images and photographs that Bill was talking about. If you the photographs and the images are kept separately, and you identify what they are and keep and in the process of developing your materials, you identify the metadata about that photo, what it's about, and what the caption is, and who owns the copyright, and who took the photograph, and who owns that. So if you keep that information together, then no matter what you're doing further down the line, you'll have the information you need to identify whether you have rights to do it, and the sizes and how they fit together, and when you want to reflow text, where the photograph belongs. So marking this up and keeping track of it and structuring is going to be valuable no matter whatever kind of publishing you're doing. And this has become a big issue. I mean, over the when people are republishing books, rights on like photographs, traditionally the contracts only covered print rights. So when publishers want to start doing electronic versions, they didn't necessarily have the rights to use the photographs and the pictures. So all this is, I think, very valuable and will continue to be even more valuable as new ways of sending out information comes up. I don't know, Bill, you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I do have a couple comments. One is that, when I talk on accessibility, one of the things I emphasize is that the standards for accessibility now align with standards that publishers are already using. So it's things like HTML tagging, and it's EPUBs, etc. The publishers and their vendors already know how to do all that stuff. So many publishers are closer to accessibility than they realize because it's just how their work is being done. But the missing piece often is the image descriptions. And so, when Mark was saying how, these images are going to have value if you say what they are, etc. Guess what? You just made the images accessible. So you've increased the value to you as a publisher for a different reason, but as a byproduct, you've also increased the accessibility of that content. And the other comment I wanted to make, because this question was specifically about a niche publisher in a very, very specialized field, it doesn't mean that the structural markup that you use has to be niche or specialized. In fact, it's better if it aligns with more broadly used standards, because then it's more usable by everybody.
If I could just jump in with a suggestion, this is Sean. I mean, discoverability is something of huge importance. And one thing about niches, they often have their own vocabulary, their own conventions. Like talking about horses, horses often have interesting and funny names that sometimes are even sentences, and they may be hard to search for. Whereas tagging a name as a name, means I'm looking for something that's got the name Secretariat, not the Secretariat of some government, and there's a lot of semantic tagging that Google pays attention to make their search results better. So, if you are inhabiting a niche, it may be hard for people outside that to find you, whereas, sort of using the structure of the data to explain some of the insider knowledge can really help. It can help librarians when they're cataloging things. It can help people when they're searching things on the internet. So just being able to identify the things that are particular to whatever category information you're working in can just do so much to help people find you if they don't know exactly where to look.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing on discoverability. This is Mark. One of the things that the internet is allowed to is made possible is that even in niche areas, it opened up the audience much larger than it ever was before, because people are not necessarily thinking in terms of equestrian those kind of sports may find that information valuable in other areas, and if you get the right metadata in there, if you get the right information and structure it properly, it can go out to all these different discoverability platforms so that it becomes much more widely available than it was before. And I think like university presses found this when this all started to happen. Previously, some very niche article was only read by 100 people worldwide because nobody could ever find it. Now, suddenly these same niche articles might have audiences of thousands. So, in terms of not just in the library and being able to discover, it's also becomes something that becomes very marketable.
Great. Okay, let's move on to the next question, which is a good follow-up because there was the mention of tagging in that conversation. So this question is, some of my content is digitized, but none of it is consistently tagged. Is this a concern if I want to revisit digitization? Do I need to start fresh with all of it? So who wants to tackle that one? Mark maybe, or Bill?
Yeah, well, I'll start with that because this is something we come across all the time. I mean, many publishers, when they're starting to look at their collections, find that they were done over a period of many years by many different vendors and many different groups, and they collect the material from many places. So the norm is that the tagging will not be consistent. So. It does make it. It doesn't mean that you have to start all over. Very many times you can use this technology that lets you remap tags from whatever they are into whatever the standard you want. Standardization of tagging is really the first step you do when you're going through trying to put together a large collection. So I think this is really more the norm than an aberration, that remapping would have to be done, and it can be done. Much of that can be automated.
Yeah, I was going to say much the same thing, and just to add one little aspect of that, even though you may have different schemes of tagging, a more important issue is how granular is your tagging, right? In other words, are enough distinctions being made, whatever terms are being used for those distinctions? If they're all done with a similar level of granularity, you could probably do the mapping, but you often run into an issue of disambiguation because something that in your present scheme need to be tagged as two different things, in your archive, it's just tagged as the same thing. That's kind of a problem.
Thanks. So next question is related to the NYPL project. So how manual is the process that DCL undertakes in creating the XML files for the NYPL project? And how much effort on average does it take to convert one copyright record to an XML entry? I don't know, Mark or Sean, who wants to take that one?
I mean, Mark might know better some of the detail. I mean, it isn't very manual. It doesn't seem to be on our end. It happens, we're doing it pretty quickly, at least up to a certain point, right? A lot of it's complicated, so we're getting it, good enough to start. And a lot of these records are really, done exactly the way we expect them, and then just figuring out which ones do we want to revisit manually later. So, like from my standpoint, like it is hardly manual at all, right? We're getting back, XML with a quick turnaround, and then it is, immediately useful, and then we start planning, how to improve it. So, Mark, I mean, I don't know, from your end, like how it seems to you.
Right. So behind the curtain. So the trick is always to make it look easy, right? So it doesn't look,
Right.
I mean, what's delivered to NYPL, I think, is exactly the way we specify and laid it out. I would say that this is partially automated over here. You know, and primarily because some of the things we talked about before, that this changes. This is going over a period of close to 100 years, and materials changed radically during some of those periods. Like these were published during the war years, during the years of World War II. They were published completely differently than they had been in other times. So the difficulty here was that it's really changing from one year to the next, and sometimes within a year. Given that, I'd say that we probably get 60 or 70% of that done automatically, and then the rest of it gets done manually. But even something that's done manually, I think it's not completely manual, because we've got some very sophisticated quality control software that comes in and lets us know what doesn't look right. So that's the stuff that needs to be looked at. So the answer is, in short, we get most of the way there automatically, but there is certainly a finishing step over here. These are by hand. And primarily because it's coming through books, and it's OCR, and it goes through several different steps. If it started off, if it's something that was done consistently over a period of 10 or 15 years, then that really improves our ability to be able to automate more. And if it's coming in electronically, that certainly improves it. So the answer is partially.
Got it. So the next question, actually, when I first saw your presentation, Mark, I had a question about this. So the question is, what are the benefits of automated OCR versus OCR? And maybe you could start with saying what OCR is for those that aren't familiar.
Okay, so, well, OCR is optical character recognition. So it's software that will go through a picture of a page, a scan of a page, and try to figure out what each of the characters are. It has to recognize that something is text, and then figure out what it is. So that's basically what it is, and that's what I originally developed in the 50s, and then really largely expanded in the 70s, 80s, and you know, to the extent that you can identify what text is, it does a good job. So and it'll get there, and depending on how the quality, like we saw some examples there where it wasn't even legible. If it's not legible, OCR won't recognize it either. But if it's very legible, it'll get there. It'll be 98, 99% accurate. So there's a high accuracy level there. The problem is when you've got other things in there that are preventing standard OCR. And what we've done is we've developed techniques that let us go in OCR pages like that also by identifying the things that will totally mess up the OCR software and cleaning that up in advance so that it does a better job when it gets there. I'm not sure if that's answered the question, but that's the automation that can be applied. So what we focus on is cleaning it up before it gets there so that the software can do a better job, and then do a lot of analytics and quality control after it so that we can identify those things that didn't get accurately OCR'd.
Yeah, I think that helps answer it. We had a follow-up question come in while you were answering it, whether you've had success using OCR on handwritten objects. I imagine that's trickier.
Well, it's more than trickier. It's I don't think it's there yet, but it depends. I mean, we've had success with reading handwriting that's constrained, the kind of stuff you see on forums where each character goes into a box. So that there's been success with that. And there's success with some kinds of handwriting when it's limited when you know something about it. But in that general case of reading your doctor's handwriting, I don't think we're there yet. But someday, I think machine learning will someday help with those kind of things.
Got it. All right. Well, I think with that, we're going to wrap up. I do want to say on behalf of Publishing Executive, Book Business, and DCL, thank you to our speakers. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. Be sure to check out our webinar page to get information on all of our archived and upcoming webinars. And if you would just take a minute to fill out the brief feedback survey that will appear on your screen next, we would be grateful. Your feedback will influence the webinars we bring to you in the future. And I hope to see everyone on the next Publishing Executive or Book Business webinar.